They called her the borrowed bride, and they said it to her face, because a girl with no name and no fortune and a made-over gown is the one person in a ballroom everyone agrees it is safe to be cruel to. What none of the 400 laughing aristocrats knew, as she stood alone at the top of the marble stairs with a sealed letter pressed against her ribs, was that the one thing she carried and refused to open would, before the season turned, force a king to his feet and a duke to his knees. Her name was Seraphina Dare, and she had come to the great ball of Vesmont House the way a debt comes due, quietly, on someone else's arm, and entirely against the will of the man who owed it. She was 23 years old. She owned a single trunk, a single good gown that had belonged first to a woman she had never met, a thin gold chain at her throat, and a folded letter she had carried since before she had words to ask what it was. Everything else in her life had been lent to her. The roof over her childhood lent by a convent that took in the children great houses preferred to forget. The education that let her read 3 languages and curtsy without thinking, lent by a guardian's grudging charity. Even this night was lent, a place at the edge of the Duke's ball, granted not out of kindness, but because a dying man's pact required it, and a dying man's pact was the only law in this house the cold Duke at the far end of the room could not simply tear up. At her breast, tucked into the embroidered edge of a gown that had been made over from someone else's, was a single folded letter, cream parchment gone soft as cloth at the creases, closed with a heavy disk of deep crimson wax she had never once broken. She had been forbidden to open it before she could read, and by the time she could read she had learned to be afraid of it, and so the seal stayed whole, year after year, a weight against her ribs no one could explain, and she would not. The nuns had told her only that it came with her the night she was left at the gate, an infant wrapped in a blanket too fine for the basket it lay in, and that she was to keep it sealed until the keeping became unbearable. She had not understood that as a child. She was beginning tonight to understand it now. At the top of the staircase she stopped, and below her the ballroom of Vesmont House opened like the inside of a struck bell, 1,000 candles, gold leaf climbing every column, crimson drapery falling 40 feet, and a sea of the most powerful people in the kingdom turning, one face after another, to look at the girl no one had wanted to invite. A woman in diamonds said her name to a neighbor behind a fan, and the neighbor laughed, and the laugh traveled outward through the crowd like a crack running across river ice. "The borrowed bride," the woman said just loud enough, "in a borrowed gown, how complete." Seraphine did not flush. She had spent her whole life being looked at as a thing that had been left somewhere, and she had learned young that the looking only owns you if you let it land. She lifted her chin a fraction and came down the stairs one step at a time, her spine straight, the sealed letter held against her heart. And she didn't give the woman in diamonds the gift of her eyes. At the far end of the room, beneath the largest chandelier, the Duke of Vesmont set down his glass. Aurelian Vesmont was 34 years old, and built like something a sculptor had carved for the niche of a cathedral, and then regretted because the face was too cold to pray to. He stood 6'2", broad through the shoulder with dark near black hair swept back from a high brow and one loose strand fallen at the temple, and his eyes were a storm gray that did not so much look at a person as pass through them and out the other side. A faint old scar nicked the arch of his left eyebrow. He wore black velvet with antique gold braid and a heavy gold signet on his right hand. And he had been, until a moment ago, enduring a conversation he had no interest in with men who wanted things from him. He was not enduring it now. He was watching the girl on the stairs with an expression that the boy holding his cloak by the door, a thin footman of perhaps 15, too new to know what he was seeing, would later describe to the kitchens as the look of a man who has heard a door open in a house he was certain was empty. Certain. He had not chosen her. That was the wound at the center of everything, and he wore it like a brand. 3 weeks ago his father had died, and his father had died owing a debt of honor so old and so binding that even Aurelian's lawyers, who could find a loophole in a coffin, had gone gray trying to break it, and failed. The terms were brutally simple. The late Duke, decades past, in a season of ruin Aurelian had been too young to remember, had been saved from disgrace by a man he never named, and had pledged in writing, with his seal, that a Vesmont son would one day take into the family the ward that man would send. No dowry, no alliance, no advantage of any kind, only a girl with a sealed letter and a duke's word made of stone. So Aurelian Vesmont, who could have married a princess of the blood, who had spent a decade refusing every match the kingdom laid before him, was to wed a penniless nobody out of a convent because his dead father's honor required it. And he hated it. He hated it in the marrow of his bones. And he was looking at her anyway and could not seem to stop, and that was the part he hated most of all. Beside him stood his cousin, Lord Castellan Vesmont, and Castellan was smiling. If you have ever watched a room full of comfortable people decide all at once and with great pleasure that another person is beneath them, and quietly, fiercely wished to be there on the day that room was proven catastrophically wrong, then you already belong here. This is the Duchess Diaries, and this is the only kind of love story I tell. The overlooked one, the bought one, the girl the whole ballroom agreed was nothing, turning out to be the one soul in the room they should all have been afraid of. If some part of you still believes the dismissed person is the one worth choosing, take 1 second to subscribe. Because what this borrowed bride is carrying against her ribs is about to bring a kingdom to silence, and you're going to want to be in the room when she opens it. Lord Castellan Vesmont was 38, lean and narrow through the shoulders, with ash-blonde hair slicked close to a long skull, and pale, watery blue eyes that never quite settled. He had a thin mouth that lived in a sneer, a sharp pointed nose, and a great many rings, and he had spent his whole life being the cousin, second to the title, second to the lands, second to the cold, golden man beside him, who had never once had to want for a thing. Castellan had wanted for everything, and he had learned to take it sideways, in small, clever thefts the family overlooked. For 3 weeks, since the old Duke had cooled in his crypt, Castellan had been next in line behind a cousin with no heir, and he had let himself imagine a future in which the dukedom slid at long last sideways into his ringed and waiting hands. A bride was not part of that future. A bride who might one day bear an heir was the end of it. She is even plainer than they promised, Castellan murmured, leaning close so only his cousin could hear, his pale eyes fixed on the girl descending the stairs. A convent mouse, in a dead woman's silk. Father's pact has made you a laughingstock, cousin. Set it aside. No court in the kingdom would hold you to a debt a dead man signed before you were born. The court of my own name would hold me to it, Aurelian said, and did not look at him. Be quiet, Castellan. Seraphine reached the bottom of the stairs. The crowd parted around her not out of respect, but out of a kind of fastidious horror, the way clean water draws back from something it does not wish to touch, and the orchestra, reading the temperature of the room as orchestras always can, let the music thin to a single uncertain violin, and then to nothing at all. She crossed the floor alone, stopped 6 feet from the Duke of Vesmont, and curtsied. A perfect, unhurried curtsy, the kind drilled into a child in a cold convent schoolroom, by women who insisted that grace cost nothing, and was therefore the one luxury a pauper could afford. Your Grace, she said. She taught. For a moment he did not answer. Up close she was not plain at all, and that was its own small injustice, because it would have been easier on everyone if she had been. She had a face that candlelight liked, fair porcelain skin, delicate features, a soft fall of auburn red hair, half pinned with tendrils escaping at the temple, and her eyes, when she lifted them, were a wide expressive green that did not drop from his the way every other pair of eyes in his life had learned to. She held a sealed letter against her chest as though it were the only solid thing in the room. You are the ward, he said. It was not a question. I am, Your Grace. You understand why you are here? To pay a dead man's debt, Seraphine said. Yes, I understand it better than anyone, I think. I have been a debt my whole life. I am only surprised to find, at the end of it, that I am to be paid to a duke instead of forgiven. A flicker went through the storm-gray eyes. He had expected, perhaps, that she would simper or tremble or weep, and she had done none of these. She had named the ugliness of the thing more plainly than he had let himself name it, and there was something in her doing so that he had not braced for and did not like, and could not look away from. You will not weep, he said. It came out almost as an accusation. Would it help me, Your Grace? No. Then I will save us both the trouble. Behind him Castellan laughed softly, and the sound of it drew the nearest guests like gulls. Charming, he said. The mouse has teeth. Cousin, do introduce us. I should so like to know the lady before the wedding, since you clearly intend to know her not at all after it. Aurelian did not introduce them. He held out his arm, stiff as a struck poker, the way a man offers his arm to a thing he has been ordered to carry, and after a moment, Seraphine laid 2 gloved fingers upon his black velvet sleeve. The contact lasted no longer than a heartbeat and meant nothing to either of them. And yet the boy by the door saw the Duke's jaw tighten as though the fingers burned, and saw the lady's chin lift another 1/4 inch, and thought, with the strange, clear instinct of servants, that these 2 people had no idea at all what they were walking toward. They walked the length of the ballroom together, the betrothed Duke and his borrowed bride, and 400 people watched them go, and did not trouble to lower their voices. It was at the foot of the gallery stairs that the old woman saw her. Marguerite had served the house of Vesmont for 30 years, and before that she had served a far greater house, one she never named, and she had a chatelaine of brass keys at her waist, and a white linen cap over silver-gray hair, and a face weathered warm by half a century of other people's secrets. She was crossing the corridor with an armful of fresh candles, when the Duke and his bride passed, and she stopped so suddenly that 2 of the candles rolled from her arms and broke on the stone, and she did not even look down at them. She was looking at the girl's face. She was looking at it the way one looks at a face glimpsed in a portrait long ago and never forgotten, at the particular green of the eyes, the particular fall of auburn hair, the particular tilt of a stubborn chin, and her kind hazel eyes filled slowly with a recognition so large she had to put one hand against the wall. "It cannot be," Marguerite whispered to no one. "Lord above, it cannot be." But no one was listening to a lady's maid on her knees, gathering broken candles, and the Duke and his bride had already passed, and the moment closed over like water. They were married 3 days later in the Cathedral of St. Aldrich, in the gray light of a cold morning, with no flowers and few witnesses, and a bishop who hurried the words, as though he too found the whole business distasteful. Seraphine wore the made-over crimson gown, because it was the only fine thing she owned, and she stood beside the cold Duke at the altar, and neither of them looked at the other. And when the bishop came to the part where a husband and wife are joined, Aurelian's voice was flat as slate, and Seraphine's was clear and steady, and only she heard the small catch in his breath when he said the word, "wife." He slid a thin gold band onto her finger over the heavy gold of his own signet, and his olive hand was cold, and her porcelain hand did not tremble. And the bishop pronounced them bound in the sight of God and the kingdom. And it was, both of them privately agreed, the loneliest moment of 2 already lonely lives. There was no celebration. The Duke had forbidden it. They returned to Vesemont House in separate carriages, which the entire staff noted and the entire ton would know by nightfall, and Seraphine was shown to a vast cold bedchamber hung with crimson and given over to the new Duchess. And there she sat on the edge of an enormous canopied bed that could have slept 6, alone with the sealed letter in her lap. On her wedding night, it was Marguerite who came to her. The old woman slipped in without knocking, her brass keys silent in her practiced hand, and she set down a candle and a cup of warmed wine, and she looked at the new Duchess sitting small and straight on the great bed, and her weathered face did something complicated. "You'll forgive an old woman?" Marguerite said quietly. "But I must ask you a thing, and you must not laugh at me. That letter at your breast. Where did you come by it?" Seraphine's hand closed over the parchment. "It came with me," she said, "when I was a child. Left at a convent gate. I've never opened it." "Never opened it," Marguerite breathed. "Why?" "I was told to keep it sealed until the keeping became unbearable." Seraphine looked down at the worn cream parchment, at the heavy disk of deep crimson wax with its crowned device pressed into it long ago. "I've been afraid of it my whole life. Some nights I think it is the only thing that has ever truly belonged to me. Some nights I think it is the reason no one ever has." Marguerite came closer, and her eyes were fixed on the seal, and her hand rose toward it and stopped, trembling an inch away as though the wax were hot. "Child," she said very low, "do you know whose crest that is?" "No." "No," the old woman repeated almost to herself. "No, of course you don't. They made very sure of that." She straightened and she wiped her eyes with the back of her weathered hand, and she said the thing that would set the whole night turning. "I served in the palace once, long ago, before I came here. I held a candle in a room I should not name, on a night I will not forget, and I saw a seal pressed into wax exactly that color, by a hand I loved more than my own life. You keep that sealed, Your Grace." You keep it sealed and you trust no one in this house with it, and least of all," she lowered her voice further still, "least of all the cousin. Do you understand me? Not the cousin." And before Seraphine could ask a single one of the 100 questions rising in her throat, the old woman gathered her keys and her courage and slipped out, and the new Duchess of Vesmont was left alone on her wedding night, with a candle, a cup of cooling wine, and a letter that an old servant had just looked at, as though it were a ghost. She did not open it. She had been told to wait until the keeping became unbearable, and it was not unbearable yet. But she sat for a long time with it pressed against her chest, and for the first time in her life the weight of it felt less like a burden and more like the edge of a door. In another wing of the same cold house, the Duke of Vesmont stood at his window and did not sleep. He told himself it was the indignity, the whole kingdom laughing. His father's pact draped around his neck like a dead man's hand. He told himself a dozen reasonable things, and not one of them explained why he kept seeing a pair of wide green eyes that hadn't dropped from his, or why, when she had said, "I am only surprised to find I am to be paid to a duke instead of forgiven," something behind his ribs had moved that he had thought long since turned to stone. He was a man who had built his entire life out of wanting nothing, because wanting was how his father had been ruined. And here, on the worst night of his pride, he had found a thing he could not stop looking at, and he resented it with everything cold and careful in him. He did not go to her. He told himself it was decency. It was not decency. It was fear, though he would not have given it that name for a kingdom. And down in the lower halls, in a small green-lit study, Lord Castellan Vesmont sat awake too, turning a ring slowly on his finger and thinking. He had watched the maid Marguerite stop dead in the corridor on the night of the ball. He had seen the old woman's face. Castellan made his living from the faces of servants, from the things they could not hide, and he had read in that one weathered face something enormous and unwelcome, recognition and fear, and a kind of fierce protective joy. And he had begun, since that night, to wonder very hard about the penniless ward with the sealed letter, and about why a dying duke had bound his house, against all sense and all advantage, to take her in. A girl that worthless, a pact that binding. The arithmetic was wrong. And Lord Castellan, who had spent his life finding the profit in other people's wrong arithmetic, intended to find it here. The morning came gray and cold, and with it came the catastrophe. In the Duke's strong room, behind a locked door to which only 3 people in the house held a key, sat the Vesmont treasures, and the greatest of these was the heart of Vesmont, a ring older than the dukedom itself, a great square-cut ruby in a band of antique gold, worn by the head of the house on the day of his investiture, and on no other day of his life. It had passed from hand to hand for 200 years. It was, in the truest sense, not the Duke's property, but his trust, and its loss would not merely cost a fortune. It would shame the name in front of the whole kingdom, because a man who cannot keep the ring of his fathers cannot be trusted to keep anything. On the morning after the wedding, the heart of Vesmont was gone. The velvet case in the strong room lay open and empty, the silk cushion bearing only the soft indentation where the ring had rested for 2 centuries, and the lock had not been forced, and the door had not been broken, and the alarm went through the great house like fire through dry grass. If you have come this far into Seraphine's story, if you have watched the borrowed bride hold her chin level through a room of laughter and a wedding without flowers and a husband who would not look at her, then take one moment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you, the part where they decide, with no proof and great relief, exactly whom to blame. It was Lord Castellan who found the proof. Of course it was. He found it with the air of a man heartbroken to find it, which is the only way to plant a thing and have it believed. He was in the corridor outside the new Duchess's chamber when the search reached that wing, and he was the one who suggested gently, regretfully, that the strong room keys hung at the belt of the housekeeper, and that the housekeeper had been seen the night before in close and whispered conference with the new bride, and that perhaps, he hated to say it, truly he did. Perhaps a girl who had arrived with nothing might have found the temptation of a 200-year-old ruby more than her convent virtue could bear. "Search your things," Castellan said softly to the steward in a voice pitched to be overheard. "I am sure we shall find nothing. I am sure of it. But the family must be seen to be thorough, for her sake as much as ours. We would not want the gossip to say we spared her." They searched her chamber, and in the bottom of the single trunk that held everything Seraphine Adair owned in the world, folded into the linen beneath her few poor things, they found the heart of Vesmont. She stood in the center of her own bedchamber with the morning light cold on her face, and watched the steward lift the great ruby ring from her trunk, and she felt the floor of her life tilt because she had never in her life seen that ring before, and she knew, with the swift, terrible clarity of someone who's been blamed for things her whole life, exactly how this would go. "I did not put that there," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything to keep it steady. "I have never seen it. I do not know where the strong room is. I was given a key to nothing in this house." "They never know where the strong room is," murmured a lady who had come to watch, and there was laughter, the small, comfortable laughter of people relieved to have their low opinion confirmed. They brought her down to the long drawing room where the Duke waited. He stood with his back to the great cold fireplace, and the family stood around him, and the ruby ring sat on a square of black velvet on the table between them, like the body of a crime. And Lord Castellan stood at his cousin's shoulder wearing an expression of exquisite sorrow. Seraphine was made to stand in the center of the room, before the semicircle of cold faces, alone, her sealed letter clutched against her chest, and she lifted her green eyes to the storm-gray ones of the man she had married 3 days before, and she looked for something in them she could appeal to. She found a wall. "The ring was in your trunk," Aurelian said. His voice was utterly without warmth. "Under your own linen. No! In a chamber locked from the inside to which you held the key." "Someone put it there," Seraphine said. "Your Grace, I beg you. Think. I arrived in this house 3 days ago. I do not know its passages. I was given no key to any strong room. How would I have crossed a locked house in the dark, opened a door I have never seen, and taken a ring I did not know existed, only to hide it in the one place on earth that would name me the thief? It is the act of a fool or a child, and I am neither. Someone wished it found. Someone wished it found in my trunk. Ask yourself who in this house profits if your bride is a thief. For one moment, one single moment, that Marguerite, standing white-faced by the door, would remember for the rest of her life. The Duke of Vesmont hesitated. Something moved behind the storm-gray eyes. Some part of the cold, careful man who had not been able to stop looking at her across the ballroom heard the cold, careful logic of what she was saying and knew it was sound. She was right. It was the act of a fool, and she was no fool. And a man who wished to could have seen in 3 heartbeats exactly whose ringed hand had laid the trap. But to see it, he would have to accuse his own cousin in front of the whole family on the word of a penniless bride he had been forced to marry against his will. He would have to take her side over his blood, his name, his pride, on the morning after a wedding that already had the kingdom laughing at him. And Aurelien Vesmont, who had built his whole life out of the cold pride that was the only thing his ruined father had left him, looked at the choice: believe the girl and shame the house, or condemn the girl and keep his armor whole. And he chose his armor, the way he always had, because it was the only thing that had never failed him. "Enough," he said. The single word fell into the room like a stone into a well. "You came into this house a debt," the Duke said, and each word was laid down cold and deliberate, and he did not let his eyes show the thing that was tearing behind them, because to show it would be to lose. "You will not leave it a thief with the run of my name. I will not have the heart of Vesmont that my fathers wore for 200 years, lifted from its case by a convent foundling the first night she sleeps under my roof. There will be no trial. A trial is a kindness, and a public one, and I will spare us both. You will be gone from this house within the hour. You will take what you brought and nothing more, and you will understand that whatever passed before a bishop 3 days ago is a thing I intend to forget by nightfall." "You are casting me into the road," Seraphine said quietly, "for a crime you do not, in your own heart, believe I committed." "I am casting out a thief," said the Duke. "You are casting out the one person in this room who has told you the truth." She did not raise her voice. She let it carry on its own steadiness, and it carried further than any shout. "And one day, Your Grace, you will stand exactly where you are standing now, and you will remember that you had the truth in front of you on a gray morning, and you let it walk into the rain because believing it would have cost your pride a single bow. I hope your armor keeps you warm. It is all you will have." And she turned, with the ruined ring of his father's gleaming on the velvet behind her and 400 years of his name arrayed against her, and she walked out of the long drawing room with her sealed letter held against her heart and her spine straight as a drawn sword, and not one soul in that great cold house moved to stop her, except an old woman by the door, whose weathered face was wet, and whose hand pressed white against the brass keys at her waist. They put her out the side gate, which was its own small cruelty, because the side gate was for tradesmen and refuse, and the things a great house wished gone without ceremony. By the time the iron clanged shut behind her, the sky had opened, and the cold spring rain came down in ropes, and Seraphine Adair stood in the road outside Vesmont House, in a plain black cloak with a single trunk at her feet, and a sealed letter pressed beneath the wool against her heart. And she had, for the second time in her life, been left at a gate with nothing but the parchment that came with her. She did not weep. She had promised herself, somewhere in the long drawing room, that she would not give this house her tears, And she kept the promise even with the rain disguising them, because a promise kept is sometimes the only thing a person owns. She bent and took the rope handle of her trunk, and she had no idea on earth where she would go. And the rain ran cold down her neck, and the great, dark bulk of the house rose behind her with its 1,000 lit windows, none of them hers. It was then that the small door in the wall opened, and the old woman came out into the rain. Marguerite had a dry shawl in her arms, and her cap was already soaked through, and she did not care. She crossed the streaming cobbles as fast as her old legs would take her, and she threw the shawl around the girl's shoulders, and she gripped her 2 cold hands in her 2 warm ones, and she held them so hard it hurt. "You will not stand in the road," the old woman said fiercely. "Not you. Lord forgive them, not you. Come. There is a gatehouse at the east wall the cousin has forgotten exists, and I have the key to it, and you will sit by a fire, and you will let me look at that letter properly, because I've spent 30 years waiting to be wrong about a thing, and I do not think I am wrong. And if I am right, child, then this house has just thrown the wrong person into the rain by a measure they cannot begin to imagine." She would not say more in the open. She took Seraphine through the streaming dark to a small, forgotten gatehouse at the east wall, and she lit a fire with hands that shook from cold and from something else, and she set the girl before it wrapped in the dry shawl, and only when the worst of the chill had left them both did she ask, for the second time, to see the letter. Seraphine drew it out from beneath the wet wool. The cloak had kept it dry. It always had. She had spent 23 years keeping it dry. She held it out in the firelight, and the old woman took it in both hands as though it were a living thing, and she turned it to the flame, and her thumb moved very slowly across the deep crimson disk of wax, and the crowned crest pressed into it, and she made a small sound, deep in her chest, that was half a sob and half a prayer. "I held the candle," Marguerite whispered. "I told you I held a candle once in a room I should not name. It was the Queen's room, the old Queen, God rest her, in the year of the Troubles, when the council turned, and no one knew, from one night to the next, whose hand was at whose throat. The Queen had a daughter, an infant, born in the worst of it, and the council that meant to take the crown meant to take the child too, because a living heir is a knife at a usurper's back forever. And one night the Queen wrote a letter at her own desk, with her own hand, and sealed it with her own seal, the crowned crest, the very one your thumb has worn soft on this wax, and gave the letter and the child to a man she trusted past all others, and sent them into the dark to be hidden where no counsel could reach. The child was never found. The court was told the infant died. A little coffin, a little stone, a great deal of grief, and the Queen was dead within the year, and the lost princess of the realm became a sad story told to children. The old woman's tears were falling freely now, until tonight, until a borrowed bride walked past me in a corridor with the Queen's own eyes and the Queen's own chin and the Queen's own seal pressed to her heart, exactly as it left her mother's hand 23 years ago. The fire cracked. The rain ran down the dark window. Seraphine sat very still, and the world she had always known turned slowly over and showed her its underside, and the underside was made of gold. "You are saying," she said, and her voice was not quite her own, "that I am her, the child The lost one? I am saying, Marguerite said, that I would stake my soul that you are. The man who carried you into the dark hid you so deep that not even you would know what you were, because a child cannot betray a secret she does not carry. He left you at a convent with the one proof a queen could give, sealed, so no one could read it or destroy it or prove it false, until the day you carried it into a room where it could be opened before the right eyes. She gripped the girl's hands again. And the pact, the old duke's pact that bound a Vesmont's son to take you in without dowry or advantage. Why would a dying duke do such a mad thing for a worthless ward? He would not. He did it because he knew what you were, and could not say it aloud, while the council's heirs still held power. And so he reached out a dead man's hand and pulled you inside the safety of his name, and married you to the one family in the kingdom strong enough to shield you until the day you could stand before the king and open that letter yourself. Seraphine looked down at the sealed parchment in the old woman's hands, the seal she had been afraid of her whole life, the weight against her ribs no one could explain. I was told, she said slowly, to keep it sealed until the keeping became unbearable. And is it not, said Marguerite, unbearable now? Cast into the rain, your name a thief's name, your husband's pride between you and every door in the kingdom. Child, there will never be a more unbearable hour than this one. This is the hour it was sealed for. Then I do not open it here, Seraphine said, and she lifted her head, and the firelight caught the green of her eyes and the steel coming up behind it. A queen's seal broken in a gatehouse is a forgery. A queen's seal broken in a kitchen is a mad woman's tale. I have been called a liar and a thief in one morning, and I will not hand them a third name to call me. If this letter is what you say, then there is exactly one room in the kingdom where it can be opened, and exactly one man before whom it can be broken, and no other place and no other man will do. She drew a slow breath. I will open it in front of the king, in his own hall, before the whole court that watched me cast out. Or I will not open it at all. The old woman looked at her for a long moment, and then she smiled through her tears, a smile that took 30 years off her weathered face. Spoken, she said softly, like your mother's daughter. Getting to the king was not a thing a cast-out bride could simply do, and the weeks that followed were the hardest of Seraphine's life. Marguerite knew the old roads of the palace and the names of those who had served the dead queen and never forgotten her, and one by one, quietly, the old woman gathered them, the few still living who remembered a true seal pressed in crimson wax. An aged chamberlain, a widowed seamstress who had stitched the infant's christening gown and could describe the embroidery no forger could know, a half-blind priest who had baptized a princess in secret and signed a record he had hidden in the spine of a psalter. The proof gathered itself, thread by thread, around the sealed letter at the center of it all. And word of it reached, in time, the one set of ears Seraphine least wanted and most needed. Lord Castellan Vesmont heard that the cast-out bride had not crept away to die in a ditch, as a properly broken woman should. He heard she was gathering old servants of the dead queen, and he heard the word heir spoken once in a tavern, and it went through him like a blade of ice. He had framed her to be rid of a bride who might bear an heir and block his path to the dukedom. He had not imagined the bride was a far larger heir than any child she might bear. If the seal proved true, she did not merely outrank his ambitions. she outranked the Duke, and every soul Castellan had spent his life envying. And the man who had framed a princess of the blood and put her out the tradesman's gate into the rain would not lose a dukedom. He would lose his head. So he did the only thing such a man can do. He went to the king's court ahead of her, the grieving cousin, and began very quietly to lay the ground for the story he needed. A mad foundling thief, cast out for stealing a great house's treasure, now forging a dead queen's seal to claim a crown. He wanted her named a fraud before she ever reached the dais, the room laughing at her, before she could say a single word. He very nearly managed it. The day she came to the king's hall, she came in the plain black cloak because she would not borrow finery to claim a crown, and she carried the sealed letter against her heart, and behind her came the old chamberlain and the half-blind priest and the widowed seamstress and Marguerite with her brass keys, a thin, shabby procession of the forgotten, walking up the center of the most splendid room in the kingdom. The throne hall of the king blazed with 1,000 candles. Gold leaf climbed every soaring column. Crimson banners fell from the high, dark vault, and the most powerful men and women in the realm stood ranked along its length in glittering silk, and at the far end, raised on a dais of pale stone, sat the king himself, old now, gray beneath his crown, the brother of the dead queen, a man who had grieved a sister and a tiny lost niece for 23 years, and had long since folded that grief away. He watched the shabby procession come up his hall with the weary patience of a king who has heard a great many impossible claims. And there near the dais, splendid in bottle green and silver, his rings catching the candlelight, stood Lord Castellan Vesmont. And beside him, drawn to court by news he could not ignore and a summons he could not refuse, stood the Duke of Vesmont himself. Aurelian had not slept well in weeks. He told himself it was the shame of the stolen ring and the wreck his father's pact had made of his name. He did not tell himself the truth, that every night since he had cast a green-eyed girl into the rain, he had stood at his window and heard her quiet voice saying, "You will remember that you had the truth in front of you and you let it walk into the rain." He had told himself he was rid of a thief. He had not been rid of anything. And now she was here in the king's own hall, and he could not have stayed away. Lord Castellan moved first, as he always did, smooth and sorrowful. "Your Majesty," he said, sweeping forward with a bow of exquisite regret, "I beg your patience for an unpleasant duty. This woman is known to my house. She is a foundling of no name whom my late uncle, in his failing wits, took in out of misguided charity. She repaid that charity by stealing the heart of Vesmont, the ring of my father's, on the first night beneath our roof. It was found in her own trunk, Majesty, by a dozen witnesses. She was justly cast out. And now, not content with the name of thief, she compounds it with the name of forger." He turned, and his pale, watery eyes found Seraphine, and the old sneer flickered at the corner of his mouth. "She comes before your Majesty bearing a letter she claims was sealed by your late royal sister. A crowned crest, in crimson wax, conjured by a thief out of a convent who cannot name her own mother. I say it is a forgery. I say she has counterfeited the seal of the crown itself, which is treason, and I say there is one swift way to prove it." And Lord Castellan crossed to the table that stood before the dais, and he took the letter, for in his confidence he had demanded it be handed up for examination. certain it could not survive one. And he laid the cream parchment flat on the table between them all, as though it were evidence in a trial, and he tapped the deep crimson disk of wax with one ringed finger. "A forged crest," he said loud enough for the whole hall, "a pauper playing at royalty. Let it be examined by the master of the seals, and when it is found false, let her be taken to the tower for counterfeiting the crown's own device. Confess you are a fraud, girl, and the king may yet be merciful. Stand on your forgery, and you will hang for it." It was beautifully done. The hall murmured. A foundling thief. A forged royal seal. The story had the satisfying shape of a thing the court already wished to believe. And Seraphine felt the old, cold weight of a room full of comfortable people, deciding what she was, and she let it come, and she looked at it and she set it down. Because there was one thing Lord Castellan, in all his cleverness, had failed to reckon with. The same thing the long drawing room and the laughing ballroom had failed to reckon with. They had all assumed the letter was empty, that there was nothing inside the seal but her lie. "You are right, my lord," Seraphine said, and her clear voice carried the length of that vast hall and silenced the murmur. "There is one swift way to prove it, but it is not your way." She stepped to the table, and she looked down at the sealed letter lying there as proof of her fraud, and then she lifted her green eyes to the old king on his dais. "Your Majesty, I have carried this letter against my heart since before I could speak. I was left with it at a convent gate as an infant, wrapped in a blanket too fine for the basket that held it, and I was told to keep it sealed until the keeping became unbearable. I have never read it. I do not know with certainty what it says. I know only that I was forbidden to break it, and that my whole life has been arranged by hands I never saw to bring it unopened into this one room. My lord cousin says I forged this seal. Majesty, I could not forge a thing I have never dared to open. I do not ask you to believe me. I ask only this. Let me break it here before you, with my own hand, for the first time in my life, and then let the seal and the hand and the words inside it speak, and judge me by them." The old king looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the green of her eyes and the tilt of her chin that troubled him, the way a melody half-remembered troubles a man, and he did not know yet why. "Break it," he said quietly. And Seraphine Adair, the borrowed bride, the thief, the foundling, the disgrace, took up the letter that had been the only thing in the world that ever truly belonged to her. And in the absolute silence of the king's hall, before the king and the court and the cousin and the cold, gray-eyed duke who had cast her into the rain, she broke the seal at last. The deep crimson wax cracked along the crowned crest with a sound like a small bone, giving way, and the page that had been closed, her whole life, fell open before the king, and she lifted it, and she read aloud the words a dying queen had written by her own hand 23 years before in the worst hour of the realm, for a daughter she would never see grown. "To whoever holds this seal unbroken," Seraphine read, and her voice did not shake, though everything in her shook. "Know that the child who carries it is no foundling and no orphan, but Seraphine, daughter of the queen, born in the year of the troubles and sent into the dark, to be hidden from the council that would have her dead. I seal this with my own hand and my own crest, that no forger may counterfeit it and no liar unmake it. By the love I bear her and the right she carries in her blood, she is the lawful heir of this realm, and any who keep her safe keep faith with their queen, and any who do her harm answer to the crown itself. I am her mother. This is her proof. God keep her until the day it is read. Beneath the words, pressed into the page itself in a circle of old crimson wax, cracked with age, was a second impression of the same crowned crest, set there 23 years ago by the same seal on the same day in the same royal hand. For the length of 3 heartbeats no one in the king's hall breathed. Then the old king rose from his throne. He came down off the dais, the king of the realm, who descended for no one, and he crossed the stone floor to the shabby girl in the black cloak, and he took the letter from her hands, and he read it with his own eyes, and his old face crumpled like a thing too long held up. He turned the page to the light. He looked at the second impression, the old, cracked wax, the date. He had seen that seal 1,000 times in his youth. He had seen it on his sister's letters, on her decrees, on the last note she ever sent him before the troubles took her. No forger living had ever held the true die, because the true die had gone into the dark with the child 23 years ago and never come back. And here it was, on a foundling's heart, exactly as it had left his sister's hand. Your eyes, the king said very low so that only she could hear, and his own were streaming. I've been trying since you walked in to think where I'd seen your eyes. They are my sister's eyes. They are my mother's eyes. God forgive me, child, they are the eyes of every queen of this house for 200 years, and I let them stand in my hall and be called a thief. He turned. He faced his court, and the king of the realm, in a voice that broke and did not care that it broke, said the words that turned the kingdom over on its axis. This is no foundling, he said. This is no thief and no forger. This is the lost princess of the realm, my sister's daughter, the heir we buried an empty coffin for and grieved for 23 years. The seal is true. The hand is true. The blood is true. She is found. And the old king, before his whole court, bent his crowned head and inclined his body to the girl in the black cloak. Your Highness, he said, welcome home. The hall went down like wheat before wind. 500 of the highest born in the kingdom, who an hour before would not have given the girl in the black cloak the courtesy of a glance, sank into bows and curtsies, and the sound of all that silk, folding at once, was like a long, slow exhalation, like a kingdom letting go of a grief it had carried too long. Seraphine did not gloat. She had spent her life on the receiving end of triumph, and she had no wish to learn its taste from the other side. She let the king take her hand, she let the old chamberlain weep openly, and the half-blind priest sink to his knees in thanks, and Marguerite, dear Marguerite, who had recognized her in a corridor on the worst night of her pride, press her apron to her face and shake. But she did not look once in that whole long moment at the cousin who had framed her, because she had decided somewhere on the road to this hall that the worst thing she could do to a man like Castellan was to make him watch his ruin come without ever once raising her voice to enjoy it. She did not need to look at him. The room did the looking for her. Lord Castellan Vesmont stood by the table where he had laid the letter as proof of fraud, and the splendid color drained from his sallow face until it was the gray of old tallow. He understood, with the swift, terrible clarity of a man who has spent his life calculating other people's risks and has just miscalculated his own, exactly what he had done. He had not merely framed a duke's unwanted bride. He had publicly accused a princess of the blood of theft. He had put the lawful heir of the realm out the tradesman's gate into the rain. He had stood in the king's own hall and called the king's own niece a forger and demanded she hang for treason. Each of these was, by itself, a hanging matter. Together they were a death too certain to argue. He began very quietly to edge backward toward the shadowed arch at the side of the hall. He got perhaps 4 steps before the king, without raising his voice, without even turning his head, said 2 words to the captain of his guard. "Hold him." And it was done. No shouting, no spectacle. 2 guards closed on the cousin from either side, and his pale eyes went wide, and for the first time in his clever, scheming life, Lord Castellan-Vesmont found there was no sideways path out, no favor to call in, no debt to forgive, nothing to take. The king's justice did not gloat either. It simply closed, and the man who had wanted everything was led from the hall to answer for it, and the court did not laugh, because there was nothing in it to laugh at, which left, in the great quiet that followed, one man standing alone. The Duke of Vermont had not bowed when the rest of the hall bowed. He had not been able to. He stood rooted where he was, the cold golden architecture of his certainty gone to silence beneath him all at once, and he looked at the girl he had married out of duty and cast out in the rain and could not stop seeing, and he understood that she was now, by blood and by the king's own word, infinitely above him, that the woman he had condemned on a gray morning to keep his pride whole held, by right, his land, his title, his name, and his fate in her porcelain hands. She could ruin him with a sentence. She could ruin him with a silence. The king would grant her anything she asked, and she had every reason in the world to ask for his head on the same block as his cousin's. And she turned at last and looked at him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The whole hall watched, because the whole hall knew the story now. The forced marriage, the stolen ring, the casting out, and the whole hall waited to see whether the lost princess would take, with one word, the revenge the king had laid in her open hand. "You said," Seraphine said quietly, and her voice carried in the silence, "that whatever passed before a bishop would be a thing you intended to forget by nightfall." "I did," said the Duke. His voice was not cold now. It had nothing left in it to be cold with. "And did you forget it?" The Duke of Vesmont, who had not bent his head to a living soul in 11 years, lowered himself onto one knee on the stone floor of the king's hall, in front of the king and the court and the whole assembled splendor of the realm, before the woman in the black cloak he had put out into the rain. "No," he said. "God help me, I forgot nothing. I have not forgotten a single word you said to me or a single hour since I let them open that gate. You told me I would stand one day where I stood that morning, and remember I had the truth in front of me and let it walk into the rain to keep my pride from a single bow. I have stood there every night since. I let them call you a thief because believing you would have cost me my armor, and I would rather have lost you than lost that. And the man who would rather lose you than lose his pride is not a man I can defend to you, or to the king, or to myself." He did not lift his head. "I have no right to ask you for anything. You hold my title and my lands and my life, and you have 100 reasons to take all 3, and I will not say one word against it if you do. But I find that the only thing I cannot bear is that the last thing I ever did to you was a cruelty. So I ask you only to let me try to make the last thing something else. Not the marriage that you may set aside and be right to. Just the chance to be, for whatever time you grant me, a man you wouldn't be ashamed to have known. Seraphine looked down at the bowed, dark head of the Duke of Vesmont, and she thought of the long drawing room and the cold morning and the rain. And she thought, too, of the one moment in that drawing room when his eyes had moved, when the cold, careful man had heard the truth and known it was true, the moment he had chosen his armor over her. She had seen the cost of that choice in his face every day since, in the king's hall, in the way he could not look away from her, the way he had never been able to look away from her. "Stand up, Your Grace," she said. He stood. He had to. A princess had commanded it. "I have been a debt my whole life," Seraphine said, and only he was close enough to hear how unsteady the steadiness was. "Lent and borrowed and paid and put out the side gate when the accounts went wrong. I told you so the first night, and you did not deny it. I will not be a debt again, Aurelian, not yours, not the king's, not anyone's. If I stay, I do not stay, because a dead man's pact bound you to me, or because a king's justice owes me a husband, or because the kingdom expects a princess to forgive a duke and make a pretty story of it. I have had enough of being a thing arranged by other people's hands." She lifted her chin. "I will stay, if I stay at all, only because I choose it, with nothing owing in either direction, with your debts forgiven and mine, and your pride on the floor where you just left it, and you winning back, one honest day at a time, a thing you threw into the rain. That is the only kind of marriage I will have. Not a debt repaid, a choice made twice by both of us, with our eyes open." "Then I will spend the rest of my life," said the Duke, "earning the second choice." And the king, watching, smiled for the first time in 23 years, and the court let out its breath, and it was, everyone present agreed, the truest thing that great cold hall had heard in a generation. She did not marry him again that day. She made him wait, and she made him work. And that finally undid the last, cold, careful thing in Aurelian Vesmont and left a man in its place. Through the long, bright spring, she lived as the princess she was, restored to her name. And the Duke courted the heir to the realm the way he should have courted his bride from the first. Slowly, plainly, with no armor, bringing her not jewels, but the small true things, a book she had mentioned, a window mended in the forgotten East Gatehouse, a pardon for a frightened maid the old regime had wronged, Marguerite with a fire of her own now and keys to rooms that mattered, watched it all and said little, because she had recognized the ending of this story in a corridor long before anyone else. And when at last Seraphine chose him, truly chose him, the second choice, made with open eyes, she did one thing on the morning of it that she had told no one she would do. She had read the letter only once aloud in the king's hall, the first page, the proof. But there had been a second page, folded inside the first, that she had not read to the court and would not, because her mother had marked it for one reader only, and her mother's hand across the top had said so, "For the one who loves her true, when she has found him." Seraphine had carried that folded second page out of the throne hall still sealed within the first, and she had kept it against her heart through the whole long spring, the way she had kept the letter her whole life, waiting for the keeping to become, in a wholly new way, unbearable. On the morning she chose the Duke, she unfolded it for him, in a quiet, candlelit gallery, with no court to watch and no crown to win. And she let him read the line a dying queen had written 23 years before, for whoever should one day love her lost daughter true. He read it once. He read it again. And the cold, golden man the whole kingdom had feared bowed his dark head over a soft, cream page worn at the creases and a circle of crimson wax cracked with age. And he wept, quietly, finally, for the cruelty he had done and the grace he had not earned, and the choice she had made anyway. And Seraphine closed his hand around the second page, her porcelain fingers over his olive ones and his heavy gold signet, and she did not tell him what the line said. That, she said, you will keep, sealed against your heart, until the keeping becomes unbearable, and then you will know what to do with it. He kept it all his life,